All right, let's bring in former Education Secretary Betsy DeVos. Madam Secretary, thank you very much for your time. We continue to monitor this hearing happening on Capitol Hill because it is an important one. People want to know if anybody's going to be held accountable, Randi Weingarten or otherwise, for what these kids and what these schools were put through during this pandemic. Where do you lie on what we're learning here and what we've heard from Anthony Fauci?
Well, Sandra, we know that Randi Weingarten and her allies are going to try to revise and rewrite history and deliberately deceive the American people over what actually happened through COVID. But we know for a fact that they work in collusion with those at the CDC to rewrite, to edit guidance, to make things more restrictive and more difficult for kids to get back into school. There is all kinds of evidence to that fact, and all kinds of evidence on how many millions of kids have fallen dreadfully behind because of adult decisions, because of adults who are trying to leverage the pandemic to extort money and concessions from the American people in order to go back to work.
Madam Secretary, you were at the Department of Education when a lot of the early discussions about how do we get schools reopened again were underway. Now, obviously, most of that was the purview of the CDC. But what were you hearing about what the union's level of involvement in those discussions was at that time?
Well, John, we held 2 summits at the White House on reopening schools in the summer of 2020, knowing that there were ways to do so safely. There were schools all over Europe that had reopened in the spring, and there was every evidence that that's exactly what should happen in most schools across the country. And I also did a whole tour with Vice President Mike Pence in the late summer to schools that were actually figuring out how to reopen safely. But the fact is that the teachers' unions and all of their allies continued to collude to demand, demand things from depending on their geography. So in LA, the teachers' unions wanted a wealth tax. They wanted Medicare for all. They wanted to ban expansion of charter schools. They wanted to, they had all of these demands that had nothing to do with getting kids safely back to school. So all through this, they have been the cause of the problem, and they continue to be the impediment to a solution.
All right, we're going to get in here in just a minute, Madam Secretary, but if you could, what would your question be in that room?
Well, my question to Ms. Weingarten would be, how can you come and honestly say that you are focused on doing, that every decision you made is focused on doing what's right for children and their futures? I don't think she can, with a straight face, claim to be thinking about and caring about students. Parents' eyes have been open to this. They have realized just how many ways their children have been held hostage to a system that is focused not on children and their needs, but on adults and their issues.
All right, she's just been introducing some of the people who are there with her, Madam Secretary, but let's listen in for a few minutes here to Randi Weingarten, and we'll get your thoughts on the flip side if we can.
And to prepare them for life, career, college, and citizenship. We know that kids learn best in person, so opening schools safely, even as the pandemic surged, guided the AFT's every action. And I'm grateful to set the record straight. From the earliest days of COVID, the AFT knew that safety was the pathway to opening schools and keeping them open. We, along with parents and administrators and health officials, we needed clear science-based guidance to keep students and staff safe in school. And yes, it made sense to consult with the CDC, and it was not only appropriate for the CDC to confer with educators, it would have been irresponsible for them not to. And the CDC conferred with more than 50 organizations about the guidance. But before the CDC, and frankly, neither the president at that time nor Betsy DeVos would confer with us, but we tried to do whatever we could. We released this report in April 2020, a common-sense, science-backed plan to open schools safely. That same month, we worked with John King, the former education secretary, focus and combat learning loss. 2020 was chaotic and terrifying. The previous administration downplayed the pandemic. Failure to protect Americans had unbearable costs. It's not just the 1.1 million Americans that died of COVID. Black children died at almost 3 times the rate of white children. 245,000 children were orphaned in America. And members of my union died as well. Gabriel Gale was a 4th grade teacher who was pregnant with her 2nd child when she died. We lost Holly Ann Hoover, a nurse, Anthony Harrell, a school custodian, and so many more. And this is what the AFT did. When the Strategic National Stockpile unstocked, we bought $3 million of PPP for our nurses and for our teachers in schools. We ran vaccination clinics. We convened virtual town halls that brought parents and educators and mental health experts together. We spent $5 million on a back-to-school campaign to get people back to school, everything from developing reopening plans, back-to-school fairs, door-to-door visits with parents, billboards, radio ads, etc. Our priorities were to open schools safely, to keep students and staff and families safe, to focus on students' social, emotional, and academic well-being, and to get the resources for this. We were fighting for better ventilation, yes, for COVID testing, and for the tools that we needed. And the same was true with parents. When President Trump left office, 46% of schools were open for in-person instruction. Between the American Rescue Plan and the work done by the CDC and other agencies, and by governors and education officials, parents and educators, including our union, we went from 46% of schools open for in-person instruction in January 2021 to close to 97% open in May 2021. Now, teachers want what students need. Let's work together now to help kids recover and leap academically. Let's expand community schools. Let's increase experiential learning and career-connected learning. Let's address educator burnout. Together, we can overcome the effects of this unprecedented pandemic, and I welcome your questions. And my apologies for being 9 seconds over.
Quite all right. Ms. Weingarten, I want to thank you for being here today and providing your testimony. I now recognize myself for questions.
All right, so we're going to jump back out of this just for a moment here and go back to Betsy DeVos quickly, because she charged, Madam Secretary, that you wouldn't confer with the union in the early days of plans to try to reopen schools. What do you say to that charge?
Well, John, that is a plain out lie. She never asked for a meeting. She never asked to confer. The unions and their allies never asked to confer. We worked hard to try to provide resources, to have a forum that they were welcome to attend, as well as everyone, on getting schools reopened in the summer of 2020. And we were highlighting the many places, and mostly in states where Republicans were governing at the state and local level, where schools were safely and effectively going back in person. If you look at the data, it's the states and local communities that are run by Democrats with a heavy teachers union, school union presence, where the kids were out of school for the longest period of time. And they're the ones that were ultimately harmed the most. And they're the ones that can least afford it.
All right, Madam Secretary, if you could hang on with us. She just took a question from the chairman there, a critical question. And that is, how did the teachers union guidance end up in CDC government guidance? Listen.
When was the first time you engaged with CDC in any way, shape, or form directly?
The first time was when they asked us to do the Zoom. I think the first time, look, I'm 65 years old. I don't remember everything anymore. I'm sorry. I think the first time was, remember, the president was.
I guess really the only question is, did they reach out to you, or did you reach out to them? Because I know they asked for guidance from many organizations.
They reached out. My recollection is that they set up this January 29th
Okay.
half-an-hour conference call.
Okay.
That's my recollection.
And again, yes or no, did that include any direct interaction with CDC Director Walensky?
Meaning, did I talk to her directly?
You or your staff?
That day, we talked to her directly.
Okay. And so that was via Zoom at that time?
Right.
Later on, were there emails, phone calls?
I think there were a couple of phone calls, but what there also were, and I wanted to just correct the record on this, sir, what you may not have asked us for is on March 23rd, 2021, we've actually had several public letters with the CDC, including March 23rd, 2021, where we actually talked about how we understood their change in terms of social distancing to 3 feet. So we had several public letters to the CDC because we wanted to be transparent of everything that was going on.
So again, yes or no, but did AFT ever provide suggested revisions to the CDC's operational strategy regarding school closures or reopenings? Did you suggest revisions to their operational strategy?
What we suggested, sir, was ideas.
Okay.
They asked us for ideas.
Your letter to the subcommittee said that the AFT proposed a handful of edits to the operational strategy. Is that right?
What happened was there was one particular edit that they accepted. There were several different ideas that we proposed. The edit that they accepted was in the, if I may explain or no?
Yeah, go ahead.
They asked us in the January 29th meeting, and you, from your document request, as you know, we provided documents including all the emails back and forth between and amongst staff,
okay.
Our staff. They asked us for...
Well, I want to get to the point, I guess. We know 2 of the proposed changes.
Right.
Work from home options for teachers with high-risk conditions, and that if a new variant arose, that the guidance may need to be changed.
Well,
so with that, and again, yes or no, were these proposals accepted by the CDC?
Well, the one proposal that was accepted during the, if I may explain, during the meeting on the 29th, we raised several different issues. We had seen all the former
Were they
Trump
accepted
guidance.
or not? I mean, it's no question. When
right.
you made these proposals, the 2 I suggested, were they accepted by the CDC?
The proposal to have at-risk, first off, the second proposal was not made on January 29th.
I didn't say that.
Sorry, the first proposal about at-risk immunocompromised workers, and not that simply that they would work at home, but there would be accommodations for people who are at risk. That proposal was accepted.
Okay. Now you've answered my question. Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm just slow.
If a new variant arose, that the guidance may need to be changed. And then, really, what else did AFT propose? I mean, I mentioned those 2 that I know of. Were there other proposals that weren't accepted?
Yes, several.
And the proposal about a new variant arising, that the guidance may need to be changed, was that accepted?
So what we asked for was because there were new variants.
Right,
that
I
were starting
understand.
to
We all know
happen.
there were new variants.
So we
I'm asking,
said...
Was the proposal accepted?
Yes. Thank
you. So before the operational strategy was finished, AFT advocated for a school closure trigger. That's the word in your documents. On January 29, 2021, in notes prepared for you before a call with the CDC, your staff recommended pushing the CDC for a trigger stating, we need an objective metric for closure, ... triggers. Then on February 11, 2021, following the need to push on a closure trigger, a member of the AFT staff emails Director Walensky directly and says, we must, however, urge inclusion of clear closure triggers in the imminent guidance. Again, on February 11, 2021, in an email from your staff, they state, our emphasis will follow Randy's statement, push on needing a closure trigger. Then in a February 12, 2021 email from you to members, you mentioned the CDC did not install a trigger, stating, while the CDC guidance does not contain a closure trigger, the guidance indicates schools may temporarily close to in-person learning. In that same newsletter, in bold font, the CDC is not mandating the reopening of schools. Why was that in bold? Why was that to be emphasized?
So which of these questions do you want me to answer?
I'm asking, well, I gave statements that we have documents on. What I'm asking is why was that statement in bold? The statement that says the CDC is not mandating the reopening of schools. Why would that be in bold?
I have no idea.
Thank you. Usually means some type of emphasis, I would think, but you don't.
I mean,
recall. You don't recall. That's By this point, though, school.
All right, we're going to continue to monitor the hearing happening on Capitol Hill. Betsy DeVos is still with us. John and Madam Secretary, if we could get your reaction to what we just heard there.
Well, it's interesting that they're talking about details nearly 10 or 11 months into the pandemic, when the reality is that most charter schools and private schools went back to school in the fall of 2020, if not in the spring of 2020. And so this notion that it couldn't happen safely is simply false. And any attempt to revise history and talk about their attempts to get kids back in school is just blatantly deceptive.
I remember, Madam Secretary, that we had our twins in public school, and it looked as though the local public schools in Fairfax County were not going to go back in the fall of 2020. But the local Catholic school had plans to reopen and reopen safely. And so we switched our kids to that school. And while they had a couple of cases of COVID, the protocol that they had in place at St. Luke dealt with everything beautifully and seemed to be, at that point, a model for how public schools could open. But the public schools didn't seem interested in adopting it.
No, exactly. And this is exactly the argument for and the reason why education freedom policy is rolling countrywide, why state over state is adopting this to put parents in charge and have the decision about where their kids go to learn. And this is going to be the best thing for kids long term and the best thing for American education.
Former Education Secretary Betsy DeVos joining us on that breaking news on Capitol Hill.